time we talked about John of Damascus and Christology in terms of the incarnation itself. Well, today we're going to turn to his more famous contribution to Christology, the idea of icons. And iconoclasm, the breaking of icons, was said to be a Christological heresy. And we'll get into why that is in a moment. But today I'd like to start the conversation with this first video where we just do a brief introduction into some of the background of icons, how icons sort of emerged and what they were used for, and then get into the start of the theology of the icons, the rationale for why to use them. But to get us started, let me show you one of the most famous icons, and this comes from the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. This is a Byzantine, late medieval icon, and yet it probably represents the way Christ was depicted even before that time, from early on. Christ there is clad in what is gilded mosaic tiles, but that's meant to symbolize the brown earthiness of his humanity, his incarnation. And yet he's also cloaked with this blue coming over it, representing his divinity. So there's the two natures of Christ already depicted in this icon. And you see this in a lot of images of Christ. One of the earliest icons that we can document comes from St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai in Egypt. And this is a very old image of Christ, and you can sort of see there the two sides of his face that looks almost as if something's wrong with one half. If you were to just cover up one side and only look at one, it would look normal. But there's like a very sharp difference between the two halves. And again, that's supposed to represent two sides. One is supposed to represent sort of the harsh, maybe judging, stern, probably divine side of Jesus, and yet there's also the softer, kinder, merciful side. You don't want one to be divine, one to be human, but you see the two sides of Jesus sort of displayed there, meant to be depicted. And this is important because these icons aren't trying to show you what Jesus looked like. They're trying to symbolize Jesus for us. Now we're going to need to get into that issue of saints and Mary because those are kind of bound up in the idea of icons. But this is an icon a friend of mine gave to me. Her family is Egyptian. This is a Coptic icon. And this is Mary with Christ, the Christ child. But notice old children in ancient depictions, they never really look like children. They look like small adults. They didn't really figure out how to draw children looking like children until much later, but that's okay because this is symbolizing Christ. So we'll get into Mary more, but let's talk a little bit more as to sort of where these icons first came from. There's a legend about King Abgarus. King Abgarus was king of the country of Edessa. That's near the Euphrates River. That is east of the Roman Empire. And at the time of Christ, King Abgarus allegedly sent a letter to Jesus. And Jesus allegedly wrote a letter back. If you've taken my course, we read this letter on the very first day. We talk about the historical plausibility or implausibility of this letter. And if you read that letter, you may be thinking, wait, I don't remember mentioning a picture of Jesus' face. But according to legend, Jesus not only sent this letter back, he also allowed a drawing of him to be taken to take to King Abgarus. Now, the reason you don't remember that is because Eusebius in the early 300s does not mention this face or this depiction. Therefore, it probably isn't historically plausible. It shows up almost 200 years later. So the people of Edessa, though, believe this to be real. This legend was that there's a painting of Christ's face, and that's probably because they had lots of paintings of Christ's face, and they're looking for where was the original one, and somewhere along the lines, this kind of claim came about for this one. There's also the Veil of Veronica. This is a legend that, again, doesn't emerge until much, much later, but if you've ever studied the Stations of the Cross, well, allegedly at one point Christ falls and Veronica takes her head covering off and gives it to Christ so that he can wipe the blood and sweat from his face, and what's left on that veil is his image. Now again, this doesn't show up for a long, long time, and so it's historically implausible, but it's the sort of thing that people in the Middle Ages took very seriously. And again, the idea must be that there were pictures around very early on, and even pictures of Jesus. Now, we know from the time of Jesus that synagogues would have used images, pictures. These are images taken from Dura Europos in Syria. This is a synagogue, and it has pictures of what we would call Old Testament stories, the Hebrew Scriptures. And there also is a house church discovered there in the same city that has pictures from biblical stories from the New Testament as well. And so churches early on, at least as early as 200, were using images and even images of Christ. These are taken from catacombs, which again would be as possibly as early as 200. We know that very early on, before 200, Christians were using the image of a fish to symbolize Christ because of the letters in Greek ichthus, make an acronym. And we know that this fish was even more popular than the cross early on. So was the anchor seen here. In Christian graffiti, it shows up a lot. But they were using images of the cross as well. I showed this at an earlier class, but there's a puzzle here. And not only can you make out the shape of the cross in these Latin words, but if you know that this image of the cross is what's holding it together, well, then you can decode it and it actually has a Christian message in it. And again, this shows up in the first century. And so Christians were using images of some sort. So now that gets us into a bit of the sort of rationale and the theology of icons. So let's stop now and talk about what these images meant to Christians. Okay, let's start now and talk about some of the theology or the rationale behind icons. I'm going to give you a few terms very quickly. First, the Greek word icon doesn't, it isn't the same word from the Ten Commandments. I'll come back to the Ten Commandments in a moment, but it's not a graven image, it's an image, a picture. Any image, any kind would be called an icon. And so those who believed in icons were called the iconodualist. Iconodualism is the love or service of, or honoring of icons, and those who would deny icons or destroy icons, iconoclasts. So iconoclasm versus iconodualism or iconophilia, the love of icons, that's going to be the debate in John of Damascus's time. And the argument from the iconoclasts is that the Ten Commandments very clearly forbids images of God. Well, John of Damascus and his party knew this commandment and took it very seriously, but they understood it to be forbidding idolatry. You can't have an image of other gods, and you certainly, how would you even depict the God of Israel? The God of Israel is invisible. The God of Israel is infinite, omnipresent, transcendent. How would you fit this into a statue or image? So they understood that God couldn't be depicted in the time of Israel. But you see, for the early Christians, they believed that something major has shifted. There has been a game changer, the incarnation. So this goes to passages like John 1:18. After talking about Moses and the Old Testament in John 1:17, it says there that no one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten God has revealed him to us. So Jesus, in a sense, shows us images for us what God looks like. Paul in Colossians 1:15 says something even stronger. He calls Jesus the icon of the invisible God. So the metaphor is something like a picture of a picture. A king will put his image on a ring, a signet ring, and then that can be stamped into the wax seal. And if that wax seal, that letter shows up, that represents the king and has all the authority of a king. So the logic goes that before all creation, the Son was begotten of the Father and in the image of the Father. And then the Son comes and takes on the form of humanity. And remember, humans are created in the image of God anyway. And so now we have in Jesus' human nature, the human Jesus is an image of the divine Word of God, who himself is an image of the Father. And so why can't we make another image of this image? Why can't we depict Jesus in pictures? Well, you can. The question would be then, what positive reasons would you give for depicting God who has now become visible? And the answer is sort of different levels of reasons. So the first level is the very most basic. You're allowed to make pictures of Jesus and of biblical characters because these are spiritual tools. They're educational tools. They're what John of Damascus calls books for the illiterate. Now, if you can depict Jesus in children's books who can't read, then that must mean it is okay to depict Jesus in images, but what else are they used for? That gets us to sort of higher meanings of the icons. And the next sort of level to that would be that icons are spiritual aids. Traditions that use icons, like Eastern Orthodox, they would light a candle, or a priest would light a candle in front of this icon, and they would pray in front of this icon. And the reason is this is, first off, supposed to bring focus. You don't let your mind wander about everything else. You're focusing on Christ, to whom you're praying. But also, even more than just focus, these are meant to be evocative. They're art, and art is evocative. So they are to draw out of us a spiritual devotion and emotion towards Christ who's depicted there. Before we had emojis, we had emoticons, icons of emotions. Well, in some sense, all good art is emotive. I've heard a story from an acquaintance we know who's not a church-going person, and she visited the Pietà, the image of Mary holding Christ after he was taken down from the cross, and she said it was so beautiful that she fell to her knees and wept. So can icons and images like this be used spiritually to draw out of us devotion? Ancient Christians thought that they could. And remember, with John of Damascus and debates about the divine nature of Christ and the Trinity, we got a lot into the abstract, right? We talked about God as transcendent, infinite, immutable, impassible, and we did all of that apophatic theology. And in a way, it's easy to sort of lose sight of God. How could you envision a God who's so transcendent? And the answer is you can't. But the good news, the gospel message is that God came to us. The God who can't be seen chose to take on human form and be revealed to us. And so these images are supposed to help. If we lose sight of God in all this abstract theology, well, we have the very tangible, very visible, very concrete Jesus who can be touched, who does have the emotional, evocative, human nature that we can relate to. So these images are further reminders of that. Okay, the last sort of level of explanation really gets into a real sophisticated theological explanation. Icons are means of grace or means of God's presence, the medium through which God's presence can come to us. I have another icon here. This was made on Mount Athos. It's to be meant to travel. You can put it in your suitcase, and wherever you go, you can have an icon of Christ. Now, what you have to imagine with an icon is that you're not just looking at wood and paint. You're not just looking at the icon. In fact, in this Eastern Orthodox tradition, it's very intentional. The icon is looking at you. You see, the icon's eyes follow you. You're being seen. You're not so much the one seeing. And the way this is explained is much like if you were to imagine in later medieval Western tradition, we can think of stained glass windows. Imagine the sun, S-U-N, shining through a stained glass window. If there were no sun out and it was all dark, you couldn't make any sense of this. This would not mean anything to you. And yet when the sun does shine through, now not only does it come through and illuminate this window, the rays of the sun are shining through this window into your optic nerve. You are receiving this light, and it is placing this image into your mind. So with icons, it's as if God himself, in his essence, is unknowable, and yet in his energies or his radiance and his love shines down to us. And yes, God's omnipresence is always with us, but God's presence can be manifested, the argument goes, by being focused, by being evocative, by shining through this like a stained glass window, through this image into us. And we now have here not just an image, not just an icon or symbol of Christ, but it's thought to be the real presence of Christ to us. Now, I mentioned how, like a stained glass window, you could only see the image if there is light, if the sun is shining through it. But the opposite is also true. You could only see the image if you had the ability to see. A blind person couldn't see this. So with icons, technically, for this to be the presence of Christ to you, it takes the eyes of faith. The person who is viewing this must be receptive and open in their hearts to Christ's presence. So you see, these icons form not just books for the illiterate. They don't only focus our attention, but they manifest God's presence to us, according to that sort of iconic tradition. Okay, well, that gives us the basics for talking about icons. But as I said, there are all sorts of ramifications, implications that we might want to ask about. I mean, what's the deal with Mary? What about all the saints? Are you really supposed to pray to an icon? Are icons not always sort of tempting us toward idolatrous faith? Well, those are questions we're going to take up in the second video. So I hope you come back, and hope that will be helpful. See you then. Have to have physical sight. A blind person, someone without eyeballs, couldn't see this. Hold on. It's Dr. White calling. Dr. White, you're on video right now. Anything you want to say to the class? Yeah, really. Hold on, let me I'm going to tell him you said that.